Dallas Airport. A flight to Boston about to close its doors. A single father, around 40, boarded first class with his 8-year-old daughter, her first birthday gift after years of saving. A young CEO nearby frowned, deciding they didn't belong there. After a brief argument, the two were moved to economy while the airline reviewed the seating. The girl fought back tears. Her father just said gently, "It's okay. What matters isn't where we sit." 2 hours later, as the plane landed, the captain stepped out of the cockpit, walked straight toward the father, stood at attention, and saluted. The entire cabin fell silent. Michael Carter was 40 years old, a single father who worked as a generator repair technician, and a former Air Force pilot who had left military service years earlier after his wife fell seriously ill. He had never once spoken to his daughter about his military career, keeping that entire chapter of his life carefully folded away, unremarked upon, tucked behind the quieter, more ordinary identity he had built for himself since. His daughter, Lily, was 8 years old, fascinated by airplanes, always hoping for a window seat whenever they traveled, and utterly convinced that her father was the most capable person in the entire world. After his wife's death, Michael had taken on 2 jobs simultaneously just to keep their household running, working long, exhausting hours without complaint, determined to provide Lily with whatever stability he could manage on his own. He spent nearly 2 years quietly setting aside whatever extra money he could scrape together, eventually saving enough to purchase 2 first-class tickets as a birthday surprise for his daughter. A splurge he had planned meticulously and anticipated with more excitement than he usually allowed himself to feel about anything. Michael had a simple lesson he repeated to Lily often enough that she could probably recite it herself. "What makes someone valuable," he would tell her, "isn't the seat they're sitting in, it's how they treat other people." It was a philosophy he lived by consistently, in ways both large and small, though he rarely explained the deeper reasoning behind it, preferring to let his own behavior demonstrate the point rather than lecture her about it directly. Amelia Brooks, 30 years old, was the CEO of an investment firm, successful and accustomed to premium service in nearly every aspect of her life, currently under considerable pressure from a major deal she was managing. When she noticed Michael and Lily settling into their first-class seats, she assumed, almost instinctively, that they had somehow ended up there by mistake, that people dressed as modestly as they were surely didn't belong in a cabin she associated with a certain caliber of traveler. She raised the issue with a nearby flight attendant, pressing the point with the kind of quiet, persistent authority she was accustomed to wielding in professional settings. As the situation was still being sorted out, Lily clutched her boarding pass tightly, her small voice trembling as she asked her father a question that clearly troubled her deeply. "Dad?" she said quietly. "Are we not good enough?" Michael pulled her into a gentle hug before answering, his voice steady despite the sting of the moment unfolding around them. "No one gets to decide your worth," he told her. "Except you." It was a simple answer, delivered without bitterness or anger, but it carried the full weight of everything Michael had tried to teach his daughter since the day she was born. That dignity was never something other people could take away, no matter how they behaved toward you. Michael had chosen those first-class tickets carefully, comparing prices for months before finally committing to the purchase, wanting Lily's birthday trip to feel like something genuinely special after several difficult years defined mostly by careful budgeting and quiet sacrifice. He remembered, boarding the plane that morning, the way Lily's face had lit up the moment the gate agent scanned their tickets and welcomed them toward the front of the line. A small, uncomplicated joy that had made every month of saving feel entirely worthwhile in that single instant. Watching that same joy begin to dim now, replaced by confusion and hurt, was harder for him to absorb than almost anything Amelia's complaint could have directly cost him. He kept his own composure carefully intact throughout the confrontation, aware that Lily was watching him closely, absorbing not just what was happening but how he chose to respond to it. He had learned, over years of difficult experiences both in and out of uniform, that how a person handled being disrespected often mattered more than the disrespect itself, and he was determined that whatever Lily took away from this particular birthday memory, it would be a lesson in quiet dignity rather than in bitterness or humiliation. As the flight attendant apologized and gestured toward the back of the plane, Michael simply gathered their small carry-on bag, took Lily's hand, and walked calmly down the aisle, refusing to let the moment escalate into something louder or more public than it already threatened to become. Michael and Lily settled into their new seats in economy while the airline continued reviewing the seating dispute, and several nearby passengers, having witnessed at least part of the earlier confrontation, whispered quietly to one another, offering their own quick, uncharitable judgments about the situation. Michael ignored all of it, refusing to let the whispers reach Lily any more than they already had. Instead, he simply continued behaving exactly as he always did, helping an elderly woman stow her carry-on bag in the overhead bin, retrieving a small toy that had rolled beneath a nearby seat for a fussy toddler, and quietly reassuring a flustered flight attendant who seemed rattled by the earlier confrontation. Amelia watched some of this from a few rows away, though she dismissed what she saw as little more than basic courtesy, unwilling yet to reconsider her original judgment about the two of them. Partway through the flight, Lily leaned close to her father and asked, quietly enough that only he could hear her, "Are you sad?" Michael considered the question honestly before answering. "Yes," he admitted, "but I don't want my sadness to become someone else's burden." It was a lesson delivered gently, without any lecture attached to it, though it captured something essential about how Michael chose to move through difficult moments. There is a particular kind of education that happens almost entirely without words, the kind children absorb simply by watching how the adults around them handle unfairness and disappointment. Lily was learning, in that quiet economy row, something far more valuable than any lesson delivered directly, watching her father choose grace over anger, dignity over resentment, in real time, under circumstances that would have justified a far different reaction from someone less deliberate about the example he wanted to set for his daughter. Later in the flight, an older passenger seated nearby began showing visible signs of panic, gripping his armrests tightly as the aircraft passed through a stretch of mild turbulence, his breathing growing increasingly rapid and shallow. Michael, recognizing the signs of a fear of flying episode from years of experience around anxious passengers during his own aviation career, calmly leaned over and began speaking with him in a low, steady voice, explaining exactly what each unfamiliar sound and sensation actually meant, drawing on his own extensive background to demystify the ordinary mechanics of flight that so often frighten nervous travelers unnecessarily. The man's breathing gradually slowed as Michael continued talking him through the experience, patiently answering each worried question without ever once making him feel foolish for asking. By the time the turbulence passed and the cabin settled back into its normal rhythm, the passenger had visibly calmed, thanking Michael repeatedly for his help, unaware that the quiet, unassuming man beside him possessed far more relevant expertise than anyone on that flight, including the crew, could have guessed simply by looking at him. Amelia, seated close enough to overhear most of the exchange, found herself studying Michael with growing curiosity, though she still hadn't fully connected the pieces of what she was witnessing to anything beyond simple, admirable kindness. It would take one more encounter, still waiting ahead of her once the plane finally landed, before she began to understand exactly how badly she had misjudged the man she had so casually dismissed only a few hours earlier. Lily watched her father calm the frightened passenger with quiet fascination, noticing details about his manner she had never really paid attention to before, the steady confidence in his voice when he described the mechanics of flight, the specific, technical vocabulary he used without hesitation, words like turbulence and thrust and altitude that seemed to come to him with unusual ease for someone who spent his ordinary days repairing generators. She didn't fully understand what any of it meant yet, but some small part of her filed the observation away, sensing, without quite being able to name it, that her father knew more about airplanes than she had ever realized. As the flight continued, Michael settled back into his seat beside Lily, and she rested her head against his arm, comforted by his steady presence despite the disappointment of the afternoon. He pulled a small deck of cards from his bag, something he always carried for exactly these kinds of moments, and the two of them played several quiet rounds together, Lily's earlier hurt gradually softening into something closer to ordinary contentment as her father's calm, attentive company reasserted itself as the actual center of her birthday celebration, regardless of which cabin they happened to be sitting in. A flight attendant passing through the aisle paused briefly beside their row, offering Lily a small pack of cookies with an apologetic smile, a quiet, informal gesture of kindness that seemed to acknowledge, without saying so directly, that something about the earlier situation hadn't sat right with the crew either. Michael thanked her warmly, and Lily's face brightened slightly at the small treat, a reminder that even amid disappointment, there were still people around them willing to offer small, unprompted acts of decency. By the time the plane began its descent toward Boston, the tension from earlier in the flight had mostly faded into the background, replaced by the ordinary hum of passengers gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. Michael had no idea, glancing out the window at the city lights coming into view below, that the most significant moment of the entire journey was still waiting for him, just a few short minutes away, in the form of a captain who was about to recognize him in front of an entire planeload of strangers. The plane landed safely, and as passengers began gathering their belongings and filing toward the exit, the captain emerged from the cockpit to make his usual end-of-flight rounds through the cabin. His eyes landed on Michael, and he stopped completely, his expression shifting from routine professional courtesy to visible, unmistakable shock. Memories he clearly hadn't expected to confront that day came rushing back all at once. 15 years earlier, Michael had served as his flight instructor, guiding him through some of the earliest, most formative lessons of his aviation career. During one particularly difficult training exercise, a serious in-flight emergency had developed, and Michael had handled the crisis with a calm, methodical precision that ultimately saved the entire training crew from what could have become a catastrophic outcome. Michael had never once sought credit for what happened that day, quietly absorbing the incident into his broader record of service without ever mentioning it to anyone beyond the immediate debrief required by protocol. The captain approached Michael's row and, without hesitation, stood at full attention directly in the aisle, raising his hand in a crisp, formal salute in front of the entire remaining cabin of passengers. "Sir," he said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the hushed plane. "Thank you for bringing us home that day." The cabin fell completely silent, passengers pausing mid-motion as they gathered their bags, uncertain exactly what they were witnessing but sensing immediately that it mattered. Amelia, still seated nearby, stared in open disbelief, the pieces of the day's events rearranging themselves rapidly in her mind. The captain turned toward Lily next, offering her a warm, genuine smile. "You have an incredible father," he told her. It was, in that single moment, the first time Lily had ever learned that her father had once served as a military pilot, an entire chapter of his life she had never once heard mentioned throughout her entire childhood. Michael, visibly uncomfortable with the sudden attention, simply offered a small, modest response. "That was a long time ago," he said quietly, clearly hoping the moment might pass without further elaboration. There is a particular kind of humility that defines truly exceptional people, a tendency to minimize their own accomplishments rather than draw attention to them, understanding instinctively that genuine character rarely requires an audience to validate it. Michael had spent years quietly living according to exactly this principle, letting his actions speak whenever necessary while keeping his history carefully out of the spotlight, uninterested in whatever recognition or admiration his past achievements might have earned him if he had ever chosen to share them more openly. The captain lingered a moment longer, clearly moved by the unexpected reunion, and began explaining, briefly, to the surrounding passengers exactly what had happened all those years earlier, the emergency, the calm, decisive leadership Michael had displayed under extraordinary pressure, the lives that had depended entirely on his composure and expertise in a moment when panic would have been the far easier, far more understandable response. Several nearby passengers listened with visible astonishment, glancing between the modest, unassuming man they had watched being publicly humiliated only hours earlier and the extraordinary history the captain was now describing in front of them. Amelia sat frozen through most of this exchange, the full weight of her earlier assumptions collapsing rapidly under the reality unfolding in front of her. The man she had dismissed as somehow unworthy of a first-class seat had, it turned out, once been entrusted with training the very pilots responsible for the safety of countless passengers across the years since, a man whose quiet competence and steady judgment had likely saved more lives than she would ever be able to properly calculate or acknowledge. She thought back to her own sharp, dismissive words earlier that day, and felt something close to shame settle heavily over her, an uncomfortable but necessary recognition of exactly how far her snap judgment had strayed from the truth standing directly in front of her. The captain, sensing the weight of the moment, asked Michael if he might be willing to speak briefly with him privately before disembarking, and the two men stepped a short distance away, exchanging quiet words that no one else on the plane could quite make out. Michael listened patiently, occasionally nodding, offering the same measured, understated responses he had given throughout the entire encounter, clearly more interested in hearing how the younger man's career had developed over the years than in dwelling on the incident being credited to him. It was, in its own way, exactly the kind of exchange that had defined Michael's approach to mentorship throughout his career, always more curious about the growth of the people he had once taught than about receiving acknowledgement for his role in that growth. Lily watched the entire scene with wide, fascinated eyes, trying to reconcile this new information with the father she thought she knew completely, the man who fixed generators and read her bedtime stories and always seemed to know exactly the right thing to say whenever she felt discouraged about anything. She found herself replaying, almost involuntarily, the earlier moment on the plane when he had calmed the frightened passenger, understanding now, with sudden clarity, exactly where that steady confidence and technical knowledge had actually come from. Several passengers nearby began quietly discussing what they had just witnessed, a few of them exchanging embarrassed glances as they recalled their own earlier whispers and judgments about the father and daughter who had been moved out of first class. One woman, who had been particularly vocal in her disapproval earlier in the flight, lowered her eyes, clearly uncomfortable with how thoroughly her assumptions had just been dismantled in front of an entire cabin of witnesses. The captain's public gesture of respect had accomplished something no argument or explanation could have managed nearly as effectively, transforming the general perception of Michael almost instantly from an unwelcome intrusion into first class into someone the entire cabin now regarded with quiet, genuine admiration. As the plane finally began emptying out, passengers filing slowly toward the exit, several strangers paused near Michael's row simply to offer a nod or a quiet word of respect before continuing on their way. Small gestures that Michael accepted graciously, but without any visible need for the recognition, clearly more focused on Lily's reaction than on anything the surrounding passengers might now think of him. Amelia found Michael near the gate a short while later, and before he could say anything, she offered a genuine, unguarded apology, her usual businesslike composure noticeably absent from her voice. Michael accepted it with the same quiet grace he had carried throughout the entire day, though he made a point of clarifying exactly what had actually bothered him about the incident. "What upset me," he told her, "wasn't the seat. It was that my daughter started thinking she wasn't good enough." The distinction landed heavily, forcing Amelia to confront the fact that her mistake had caused a harm far more significant than mere inconvenience. Amelia knelt down in front of Lily and apologized to her directly, choosing her words with visible care. Lily listened thoughtfully before responding with a small, genuine smile. "My mom used to say," she told Amelia, that someone who knows how to admit they're wrong is even stronger than someone who's never wrong at all. The simplicity of the observation, delivered so naturally by an 8-year-old, moved Amelia to tears, the professional armor she usually wore into every interaction finally giving way completely. There is a particular kind of courage required to apologize sincerely, especially for someone accustomed to positions of authority and control, someone whose professional identity often depends on projecting unwavering confidence and correctness. Admitting a mistake doesn't diminish a person's standing, however counterintuitive that might feel in the moment. It demonstrates, instead, a willingness to grow, a kind of strength considerably rarer and more valuable than the ability to simply avoid error altogether. Amelia stayed a while longer, talking with both Michael and Lily as the airport slowly emptied around them, asking careful, genuinely curious questions about Michael's military career, questions he answered with characteristic modesty, offering only the broad outlines of his service without dwelling on any particular achievement. She found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, genuinely enjoying the conversation, drawn in by the same quiet, unassuming warmth that had apparently shaped so many of Michael's interactions throughout the flight. The elderly woman's luggage, the frightened passenger's turbulence, the countless small kindnesses that had nothing to do with his military record and everything to do with the kind of person he simply chose to be every single day. Before they finally parted ways at the airport, Amelia mentioned, somewhat tentatively, that the entire experience had left her thinking seriously about how her own company trained employees to treat customers, particularly those who might not immediately fit whatever narrow expectations staff had unconsciously developed about who belonged where. Michael listened with quiet interest, offering a few thoughtful observations of his own without ever positioning himself as any kind of authority on the subject. Content simply to let the conversation unfold naturally rather than steering it toward any particular conclusion. Lily, tired but happy, leaned against her father's side throughout the exchange, the disappointment of the earlier flight now feeling like a distant, almost forgotten memory compared to everything that had happened since. As they finally said their goodbyes, Amelia exchanged contact information with Michael, half apologetically explaining that she wanted to stay in touch, unsure yet exactly what that might look like but certain, in a way she rarely felt about anything, that the encounter had mattered too much to simply let it end at the gate. Michael accepted the gesture graciously, though he made no particular effort to encourage it further, content, as always, to let whatever happened next unfold in its own time rather than pushing toward any specific outcome. Walking away from the airport that evening, Amelia found herself replaying the entire day repeatedly in her mind, unable to shake the discomfort of how quickly and thoroughly she had misjudged a man based on nothing more than his clothing and the modesty of his manner. It was a discomfort she suspected would linger with her for considerably longer than the memory of the deal she had originally been so preoccupied with securing that morning. A reminder that the assumptions people carry into ordinary interactions can sometimes cause far more damage than they ever intend, and that correcting them, however uncomfortable, remains one of the more important things a person can choose to do. 6 months later, Amelia rolled out a new customer service training program across her company, its very first lesson built directly around a simple, deliberately worded principle. Never judge a passenger by their appearance. She invited Michael to speak to her staff about leadership and composure under pressure, and though he initially hesitated, unaccustomed to public speaking of any kind, he ultimately agreed, moved primarily by the thought of Lily sitting proudly in the front row watching him. His talk that day focused less on his own military history and more on the quieter lessons he had spent years trying to pass along to his daughter, the belief that genuine strength rarely announces itself loudly, that dignity has nothing to do with the seat a person occupies or the clothing they happen to be wearing, and that true leadership is measured far more accurately by how a person treats others during small, unremarkable moments than by any single dramatic achievement they might occasionally be recognized for. The story's final scene unfolded on Lily's 9th birthday, nearly a year after that first difficult flight, as father and daughter boarded another plane together. this time settling comfortably into economy seats without any hesitation or disappointment on either of their parts. "I don't need first class anymore," Lily told her father with a bright, easy smile as she buckled her seatbelt. When Michael asked her why, she took his hand and answered simply, "Because sitting next to you," she said, "is already the best seat there is." Michael turned toward the window, quietly smiling to himself, moved by a sentence that captured, more completely than any recognition or apology ever could, exactly what mattered most about everything that had happened over the past year. It was a moment no first-class ticket, however expensive or exclusive, could ever have purchased on its own. A simple, unguarded declaration from his daughter that reminded him, more powerfully than any salute or public apology had managed, that the true measure of the life he had built with her had never depended on where they happened to be sitting. As the plane climbed into the sky, Lily pressed her face against the window, watching the clouds drift by with the same wide-eyed fascination she always brought to flying, while Michael sat quietly beside her, content in a way that had little to do with cabin class and everything to do with the steady, unshakable bond between them. A bond that had, if anything, only grown stronger in the year since a stranger's careless judgment had briefly threatened to convince his daughter that she wasn't good enough for the world around her. Amelia, coincidentally traveling on a different flight that same week, later mentioned to a colleague that the training program inspired by that difficult day had already begun changing how her staff approached customers across every level of the company. Fewer complaints about dismissive treatment, more genuine warmth extended to travelers regardless of how they happened to be dressed or which class of ticket they carried. She kept a small note on her desk, a simple reminder she had written to herself the evening she first apologized to Michael and Lily at the gate, words that had stayed with her ever since. Dignity is never determined by a seat number. Have you ever unknowingly judged someone just by how they dressed or where they sat? What do you think makes a child feel truly valuable? Expensive gifts or a parent who always stands beside them? If you were Amelia, what would you do to make things right after a flight like that? A person's dignity was never dependent on their seat class or their wealth. Humility is what makes truly exceptional people even more admirable. A sincere apology can heal invisible wounds. And the most precious thing a father can give his child isn't a first-class flight, but the certainty that she will always deserve respect.